Hey, Nige.
Hey, E.
We have a special treat today.
Yes, we do. It's part of a collaboration we are doing with our friends at the venerable live storytelling project, The Moth.
Yep, we're bringing you a story from The Moth that I actually heard live a while back at one of the Moth's main stage events in San Francisco.
Yes, Earlonne, I remember you were super excited about it, and I'm sorry I didn't get to go with you. But let's just explain. The main stage events are where the storytellers work with a director from The Moth to get their story all polished up, and sometimes they get to take these stories on tour.
And you know, Nige, ever since I heard this one, I've been wanting to share it with our listeners, so I'm glad we finally have an opportunity to do that.
But before we hear that, we're going to give kind of a Moth primer for folks who may not be as familiar with what they do.
You and I talked to Edgar Ruiz Jr. He is the manager at the Moth Community Engagement Program. Before that, he was a host of Moth events, and he got his start at a Moth Story Slam in the Bronx, where he grew up.
I was a Moth fan. I went to a slam one day, and I was picked first.
Oh, boy.
I told a story. It was one of those emotional stories that I needed to get off my chest, and the Moth crowd, I confessed my sins, and they helped me heal. And
okay, I got to ask. I've got so many questions now.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you go to a Moth Slam, do you know that you're going to get picked?
No, it's all, I call it by chance of the story gods. Sometimes you'll have 50 slips in a bag. But that day in particular, as soon as she picked the name out the bag, I knew it was mine. I was like, oh, I'm going first.
Okay. And how did your stomach feel?
Oh, man, it always feels the same. I'm always nervous. I've been doing this for like 5 years, and right before I take the stage, tell a story or host any of the events, I get nervous. It's like getting on a roller coaster, you know, that going up the roller coaster, you know, your nerves are like going crazy. And then, but once you hit the stride going down, it's all fun after that. You know, once I get on the stage.
My hands are sweating for you right now, just thinking about it. Oh. Okay, well, sorry to do this. Can you just do the first line of the story for us? As you recall, you got up there, you see the audience, you're doing whatever with your hands. What was the first sentence?
Oh, man, I think it was like, it was 2006. I'm laying in the bed with my girl, and we're watching what's the show with Flavor of Love. We're watching Flavor of Love. Like, you know, that was the beginning. And right off the bat, I was like, I got a good laugh. And I was like, whoa, you guys are not ready for this one.
Was the audience really important to you? Did you feel like they were pushing you forward or holding you back?
No, the Moth crowd is a very loving crowd. It's a very nurturing, you know, it's the opposite of stand-up. You know, like I do stand-up, and I've been in moments where a punchline gets up. And it's terrible. You don't ever want to be a part of that. But a Moth crowd is the complete opposite. Is they love you. They want to see you succeed. You know, I had moments where like I got emotional. I get emotional all the time, and they'll encourage you to keep telling your story. They want you. They want to hear your story. They're there because they want to help you heal a lot of the times.
Wow. Okay, Earlonne, I think we need to step back just a little bit because I know, you know, most people know about The Moth and what it is.
Right.
You know, it's a radio program. It's also a podcast. But could you just give us like a quick run through of like, what is The Moth?
Well, everybody pretty much knows The Moth as the radio program on NPR, you know, the podcast that got downloaded a whole bunch of times. But I think a lot of people don't know that we do the National Weekly Slams. You know, this is where most of our stories come from. Most of our storytellers come from the slams. We have the main stage. Then we have the Grand Slams. The Grand Slams are the ones where we have top stories go against each other for like for storytelling supremacy, like Pokemon, like the best story versus the best story. Those are like the Super Bowls of storytelling for the Moth. But we also do workshops. Our jobs is to basically try to get stories from everywhere, try to reach different voices, different ethnicities, colors, race, creed. Like we want to make sure that we can get to everybody and give them a space so they can share their story, a platform. We have the community program that works with not-for-profits and cultural institutions. We have the EDU program that works with educators in high schools and colleges and students. We have the Moth Works program that does corporate level professional storytelling. And we have the global program that's like internationally. The whole point of us is to make sure that we give everybody an opportunity to share their experiences.
In those workshops, what are the essential ingredients that you're teaching people about how to make a Moth story?
Well, some of the guidelines. You want a story obviously needs to have a beginning, middle, and an end, right? Mm-hmm. Some people try to get a life story in 5 minutes, which is kind of hard. It tends to be like bullet points. So we try to like have our storytellers focus on 1 or 2 scenes. We want to make sure that the story comes from the storyteller's perspective. We don't ever want to influence their story. So what we do is just pretty much ask a bunch of questions. Like, so your story is about you riding around in a Cadillac. How does it smell? Mm-hmm. Is it hot? Is the AC broken? We ask questions like that. Are you parked in front of your house? Is it your house that you grew up in? We just ask those type of questions to get the mind working. Because sometimes people tell the superficial part of the story, what they see on top, but there's things behind it, that the details, the smells. We ask those questions to make their story more impactful, more detailed. And then the most important is like, how did it change you? You know, what did you learn from this experience?
And so how do telling your story to a live audience change, as far as your experience?
It does. Because, you practice your story a bunch of times in the mirror, alone, to your loved ones, pets. And then you're there, like in front of a bunch of hundreds of people. And it makes it real. You're taking the roller coaster ride and you're about to go down the hill. And it's thrilling and it's exciting. It's nerve-wracking, but it's so fulfilling, because the Moth crowd loves you. And, sometimes if you pay too much attention to the crowd, it could, deter you from your story sometimes. I tend not to look at people when I'm telling stories. Like I look past them. I'll look at the light. I'll look at a clock. Like I can't look at my wife at all when I'm telling a story, because she's like, there was this one story I was telling her and I was talking to the crowd and then I looked at her and I was like, oh my gosh, she's so beautiful. And I lost my place. And I was like, I'm not looking there ever again.
Got distracted.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah,
that's so lovely. Why do you think the Moth audience is so receptive? You keep using the word they're loving and supportive. Why do you think that is? How does that happen? Because that's, that's not always the case in events like this.
I think the Moth crowd is all about empathy. They want to be entertained, but they also want to be present for somebody else's life, somebody else's story. Their job, their main job when they come to a Moth event is that you got to take care of the people that are coming up here, because these people are opening their hearts up, their souls.
So Nigel, as you know, I did go to a live Moth show in San Francisco.
And I'm jealous. I wish I'd been there with you.
And the guy that we're going to hear a story from, Michael Fischer, he was telling a story that I related to. I didn't know if anybody else in that audience related to the story that he was telling, but I was 100% in that story.
So here's Michael Fischer from the Moth.
About 1 week into my sentence, the guards put the whole prison on lockdown. I was in what's called reception, waiting to be classified and then sent to a different prison to serve my 2 years. The rumor was that an inmate had convinced a civilian worker to smuggle in drugs, and they'd shut everything down to look for the contraband. I still don't know if that's true, but we were on lockdown for weeks over something. In our cells all day, every day. No mess hall, no showers, no yard. Just guys yelling back and forth, day and night. I was in this big cell block. It was 4 tiers high on both sides that held 400 other men. But I was alone. Every time the porter came by to drop a bag meal on the little shelf of my cell gate, I wanted to go for a handshake or a fist bump, anything, just to make contact with another person. But I was afraid the porter would just see some strange guy trying to grab him through the bars. About 10 days into lockdown, my cell buzzed open after morning count, and the tier officer sent me to medical. I was born with a heart problem. I've been having surgeries for it since I was a kid, so apparently I had to see a cardiologist before the state could decide which prison to send me to next. That meant leaving the lockdown behind for a day and going to a hospital in the free world. To see a doctor on the outside, I had to be strip searched and have my wrists and my ankles shackled. The handcuffs were connected to a chain around my waist, so I could only lift my hands a couple inches. Think of it like the choke collars some people use on dogs. I wasn't used to ankle cuffs that early in my bid, and this was January in New York, so I waddled through snow to the transport van with an officer on either side of me, and then sort of threw myself into the back seat because I couldn't use my hands. How boring you think the waiting room at your doctor's office is depends a lot on where you're arriving from. I was so excited to sit on a real chair instead of a steel bench, to be in a quiet room that didn't smell like sweat or urine or disinfectant. But when I shuffled through the front door of the doctor's office, one of the COs with me said, "Come on, we're not stopping." He led me down a hallway, and I stood against a wall while the other officer checked me in. Pretty naive to think I'd be allowed to sit and wait with the other patients. They would be afraid of me. It occurred to me that this trip might not be the break I'd hoped for. I thought being in the free world for a day would be great. See mailboxes and billboards again, look at people in their cars and wonder about their lives, pretend I was just on my way to work like everybody else. I thought I would feel almost normal, not like some animal escaped from the zoo. The staff clearly wanted me out the door as fast as possible, so pretty quickly the officers and I were shown into an exam room. The cardiologist walked in with a nurse right behind him, and he looked at me and said, "Michael?" Used my first name as if I were any other patient on his schedule, and I said, "Yeah, I'm Michael." The cardiologist started a physical exam, and just the feeling of his stethoscope against my chest, I might as well have been at a spa. I started reciting my medical history using all the technical terms I've learned from dealing with heart disease my whole life. And when I'd finished, the nurse tapped my ankle cuffs twice with a finger and said, "You're too smart for these," which was supposed to be a compliment. I wanted to tell her that's not how it works. The guys on my cell block weren't locked up for being stupid. But to be honest, a part of me felt flattered. This nurse and this doctor were treating me like I was a real person. They thought I was smart, and they weren't afraid to look me in the eyes and lay their hands on me. After weeks of no human touch and no dignity, to suddenly have people do things as simple as speak to me kindly, or listen to my heartbeat, or feel for swelling in my legs, I decided I would pay any price for that. Just to feel the touch of another person for a minute, and to know that person's here to help me, and to hope that meant I still deserved help. From the moment the officers put me back in the van, I had a new plan for my time in prison. Take as many medical trips as possible. Even though it would mean waking up at 4 a.m. and the cuffs and chains for 12 hours straight and the looks from every person along the way, I needed that reward at the end. I needed contact with people who treated me as if I was still fully human, because I wasn't sure I even believed that anymore. So I started lying. I was transferred from maximum security reception to a different prison, and almost as soon as I got there, I started complaining to the medical staff about symptoms I didn't actually have. But because my heart problem really is serious, everything I said was believable. So they started sending me out on more medical trips. Sometimes more than once a month, I'd get to take these awesome long drives through the countryside into the city. 2 officers and I would enter through a back door that was only used to take out the hospital's trash and bring inmates to appointments. It always took a while to reach the cardiology clinic because every time someone came walking towards me, the officers would have me turn to the wall and stare at my feet until the person passed. But I still caught sight of faces. I saw people pull their children close, or dart down random hallways, or pretend to forget something and just turn around. Still, it was easier to mark time by my hospital trips than by what I was missing back home. My sister got engaged and then married, but I had things to do too. I had an appointment to get a CT scan. My grandma's dementia got worse until she forgot who I was, and it became hard for me to sleep through the night without having a panic attack. But at least my grandma couldn't remember to be ashamed of me anymore. At one time, the doctors gave me what they called twilight drugs so they could put a scope down my throat, and that was almost as good as real sleep. My aunt died of pancreatic cancer, and because her funeral was out of state, I wasn't allowed to attend. But what I could do was stare out the windows of the transport van and pretend I was someone else. I knew I was wasting people's time and the state's money and scaring everyone I saw each time I left the prison, but I didn't care. I needed the connection and I needed the escape. I remember lying fully conscious on an operating table, handcuffed to the side rails, during yet another procedure that I'd talked my way into but didn't really need, where the doctors were threading a scope up through an incision in my groin. And I remember thinking, this is so worth it. By the time my sentence was almost over, I'd taken more than a dozen medical trips. I should have been focused on my release, but I didn't want to think about life as a convict. I definitely wanted to get out, but there's a difference between getting out and truly going home. I was afraid home had changed so much for me that it wouldn't feel like I belonged anymore. On my hospital trips, I could catch sight of freedom without having to really deal with freedom. But as my release date approached, I started to wonder what good the trips were doing me. The van would be driving me to some appointment, and I would think, what if from now on, I only know how to navigate the free world as a tourist, like I am now? What's going to happen when I actually live there? On one trip, towards the end of my bid, the COs parked the van by some dumpsters in the back, like always. But this particular doctor's office was special because here, I was allowed to sit in the waiting room, off in a corner behind this big pillar. I didn't look at the other patients, even though I really wanted to. That seemed like the one nice thing I could do in public. Try not to bother people too much with the fact that, I exist. The nurse who called my name was around my age at the time, early 20s. Once we were in the exam room, she asked the officers to take off my handcuffs so I could remove my shirt. They took off the cuffs and I took off my shirt, and the nurse explained that she was going to stick some leads to my chest so that she could run a test. So I lay back and closed my eyes, and when her hands touched me, I had to grit my teeth to keep myself from crying. In a different life, she could have been a friend of mine, but there in that room, I kept wondering if she was afraid of me. She tried to run the test, but she wasn't getting a clean signal, so she started pulling off the sticky lead pads to rearrange them, and each one was pulling out a little patch of my chest hair. I remember she winced as she pulled off the last lead, and she said, "I'm sorry about this." She apologized to me. And that broke the spell. Suddenly I felt so embarrassed that I brought myself and these two big officers into this nurse's space, just so I could, deny reality? Feel better about myself for 10 minutes? She was just trying to do her job, and it was not her job to somehow make me fully human again. It was my job to know that I'd never stop being fully human, that I still deserved connection and compassion, whether anyone in any courtroom or waiting room agreed or not. Because the alternative was to keep feeling ashamed and to keep thinking of myself as a loser and to go through life begging other people, like this nurse, to prove me wrong, to give me some small sign that maybe I'm not so bad after all. That was my last medical trip. I told the prison doctor I was feeling just fine after that. And then, a few months later, I packed my stuff, signed my release papers, and they let me go. Living in the free world again has been about as hard as I expected. But despite that, I have to find my way as a citizen of the free world, not just as a tourist. Because if I can't, I'll never belong anywhere. Thank you.
So that was Michael Fischer telling his story on the Moth.
Yes.
And now we get to talk to him.
Yes, definitely we do.
Yeah, I love that story. I've heard it a couple times now. I really like how you concentrate on all the senses in it. So thinking about the smells and the touch and the sights. So how was it telling that story to a room full of strangers?
Well, thank God you can't see anybody. So that's kind of the best thing about these Moth shows is they've got the lights kind of blaring in your face and you feel like you're just in a really big room alone, which is probably for the best. I think the most surprising thing about it for me was that by the time I was up on stage telling it for the first time, I had run it over and over with my director and I knew it and I'd written it down. And so I knew it really well. And I thought because I know it really well, I felt like I was really on top of it, both like practically, but also emotionally. And I think the biggest surprise about the show, all the shows, was that almost every time I would get emotional in the same spaces too, you know, like toward the end when she's touching me or when she says I'm sorry or when I talk about am I just supposed to live the rest of my life feeling like a loser? And there's no other explanation I can think of for that except that like it's just different when a room full of people. Like you can, even if you can't see them, you know, whatever, like there's an energy to being with a bunch of people and like knowing that you're sharing something that kind of re-emotionalizes the story all over again, even if it's something that couldn't reach me anymore emotionally because I just knew it so well.
It's a trip because I went to see it in San Francisco. And I was sitting there and I heard all the stories that night. But of course, this one resonated with me. Mm-hmm. So when you were up on stage telling this story, I was invested. I was like, man, I understand totally because the prison bus or the transfer bus was like my Disneyland. I didn't get on it too many times, but the times I did get on it, I appreciated it because it was a window to the world. You know, you out there, you free for a moment, or again, wishing you was in some other car doing what they were doing, going wherever they were going. You know, so I definitely understood your story for real.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have Earlonne's experience or your experience, but it held me from the beginning. It's so emotional, and as I was listening, I was thinking, boy, if I were in prison, I guess maybe I didn't learn from your story. I might do the same thing. I mean, I could see the draw to it. Actually, I got to say this. I'm surprised you got such good medical care. Aren't you kind of surprised?
He went to the streets. He wasn't in prison?
That he was able to get appointments like that. I didn't.
Oh, because the prison don't have doctors for that.
I know. I just didn't know that you could. I always hear people waiting to be able to leave prison. But was that unusual that you were able to leave so often? I mean, does that speak to the severity or where you were?
I think it speaks to both. I think it speaks to a lot of things. I think it speaks to like me being white. I think it speaks to them knowing that I had like family that was paying attention. And I think that's always a big deal. And my mom used to send me mail like almost every single day. And a lot of times there was like almost nothing in it because like, what can you really say, you know, day after day after day. But when I would ask her about it on the phone, she would say, I want them to see you getting mail. I just want them to know that there are people out here that care about you and that know that you're there and that are paying attention. And so
interesting strategy.
Yeah. So things like that, where like, I think like, I don't know if that particular thing actually did anything, but I think there was this general sense that people were paying attention, you know, they don't want to get sued. And I also think it was kind of weird. Like, you know, not a lot of people, you know, you go into prison and you say like, hi, at the time, you know, 23 years old and I have no natural heartbeat whatsoever. People are like, wait, what? And so I think, it wasn't something that they wanted to mess with at the facility because if something, you know, if they mess up the settings or whatever and they press the wrong button, like I'm not like on life, like I'm dead. Like I have no natural heartbeat whatsoever. And so, I think they were more careful than maybe they would have been normally.
So how long after you got out of prison did you do your first, start working with the Moth?
I went to my first story slam I think when I was about a year and a half out, I got out in early 2015. I moved to Chicago in summer 2016. And I think like later that summer or that fall, I went to a story slam because I'd listened to the Moth podcast for years by that point. And I would, I'm kind of competitive. And so I would listen to the stories. And like, to be honest, sometimes I would think like, man, that's not that good. Like I could do this. And they always say at the end of every episode, like, oh, if you want to tell a Moth story, go to a slam in your city. And so I heard that at the end of an episode one time and I was like, well, you're always talking about how you think you're such a good storyteller. You think you could do this. If you really think that, why don't you go? Like, why don't you actually go and see if you actually can, or if you're just full of shit? But to be honest, like, so part of why I went was because of that sense of like, kind of put up or shut up. Like, if you really think you can do this. And part of it, honestly, was, I thought I would meet people. Like, I did it as a way to, I tell the Moth producers all the time. Like, I did it to try to make friends. I thought, I just moved to Chicago. I didn't know anybody. I was 6 months off parole. And I thought, maybe if I get up on stage and I tell a story, maybe someone will come up afterward and be like, hey, that was a really cool story. And like, want to be friends? Whatever. It's going to like start some kind of conversation. And like, that never happened. People would come up, but then people would come up and say like, that's really great. Like, nice story. But like, they didn't, they're not like trying to make a friend. And so I would be, and I probably like, how that is where like when people can sense when you like need something. And I think I probably like came off needy and people could tell like, never mind. Like, we got to get away from this guy.
So a question I have, so it was some years after you got out of prison that you did this. When you're telling the story, where does it bring you emotionally?
That's a good question. I think it roots me very firmly in the present, actually. And I think that's part of what is so emotional about it when I tell it in front of an audience, is that, like, for example, that San Francisco show, that was a really meaningful show for me because I've been on tour with that show, with that story for like more than 2 years. I've been to London with it. I've been like, all over the place with it and had some amazing experiences telling it. And because my best friend since second grade happens to live in San Francisco. And so he was there. And my partner here in Chicago, she flew out for it because, again, we like thought it was going to be the last time. So like she was also there. And so to have both of them in like the third row and like be able to see them from the stage because they were kind of within the range of the lights at the bottom of the stage was really powerful for me. And so it in a weird way, it actually brings me to the present because, I have these moments all the time, including right now, where I think to myself, like, man, I just never would have thought. Like, I just never would have thought. I remember like when we did the London show and I was walking around London and I'm like walking by Parliament and I'm like, who the fuck would have thought that somebody was going to pay me, not just like let me, pay me to fly to London, which I wasn't even sure I could get into. I told them we have to connect through Ireland because I don't know if the UK will let me in direct, but I know I can get into Ireland. So like, I'm like, I cannot believe these people jumped through all these hoops to bring me to London so that I could, and to tell this story in this 200-year-old church. This is like the coolest thing I've ever done. And so every time I tell the story, I'm really thinking about like, I'm really just grateful. I'm thinking to myself, like, it doesn't like pull me back there and like, oh my God, I'm in prison again. If anything, it's like the total opposite. It's like, this is totally over.
See, that bus ride went far.
Yeah.
All the way to London.
So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, did you learn anything about yourself while you were working on this story?
I think what I learned while I was putting the story together was that I really haven't changed that much since I was a little kid. Like, even just hearing it just now, I was like, gosh, I am so like sensitive. Like, I remember when I was like 7 years old, I was wearing shorts and somebody told me my legs were like, just offhanded comments of like, man, your legs are really skinny. And I didn't wear shorts again for like 20 years. Like stuff like that. And when I hear when I hear the story and I hear me like being so hit by, him saying we can't stop in the waiting room, or so hit by her saying, the nurse saying, you're too smart for these, or so hit by the nurse saying, I'm sorry about this. It reminds me of like that at the end of the day, I'm still just like a little kid who is affected very deeply by the way people like talk to me and treat me. And I think, when I was in prison, I didn't have emotional bandwidth to like open myself up to that in that moment because there was too much going on. But I think writing the story after the fact, I was able to look at all that and be like, gosh, you were still just really... The best advice I ever got about prison, before I even went in, this guy I knew who had been to prison, I like sat down with him basically for like a, what you should know about going to prison conversation. And I remember him saying to me, best thing he said, he was like, just be yourself. You have to be yourself. Even if you think that's like not the cool thing to be, you have got to be yourself in prison, because if you're not, people are going to know in an instant. You can't put up a front 24 hours a day, and people will know in a second, and they will expose you, and like it's going to be a problem. So it doesn't matter if you're not tough. It doesn't matter if you're not whatever. Just don't pretend to be something you're not, and you'll be okay.
So we were going to ask you if it's hard for you to talk about your prison experience in public, but after what you just said, I have an assumption of how you're going to answer this.
Yeah, it's not, because it's mine now. Like that's what I like about the storytelling. That's what I like about writing is like I'm telling the story now. It's my narrative. It's not happening to me. Like, it's not passive. It's funny. One of the things I found hilarious when I first got out of prison is that people were afraid to say the word. It was like Voldemort. People were afraid to say the word prison to me, and so they would use all these weird euphemisms. They'd be like, "So, how's it been since you got home from the big house, or since you got from the thing?" Like, they were finding all these weird ways to, and I was like, just say prison, it's okay. Like, it's not, a thunderbolt's not going to come down. Like, I'm not afraid. Like, you can just say prison. And I think in that same vein, for me, that's what the storytelling and all of it is. It's like, I'm not afraid to say prison. I'm not afraid to say convict. I'm not afraid. It has no power over me. It's just a word.
And you talked about being worried when you were released from prison that you would feel like a tourist in the free world. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, I did at first, partly because the age window in which all this was happening was so specific. I got convicted at 21, I went to prison at 23, and I got out at 25. And so it was this kind of very pivotal period where a lot of my friends were, getting their first jobs out of college and finding partners, or even marrying partners, or even having kids in some cases. And I remember getting out and feeling just super, super behind. I turned 26 2 months after I got out. And I remember looking around and being like, gosh, everyone's got a job, everyone's got stability, everyone's a real adult. And I still felt like I was just kind of a kind of late teen, early 20, still fucking up, still subletting and, sleeping on people's couches, and I don't have credit. And, I didn't feel like a real adult. So yeah, tourist, or really just kind of like an alien. I felt like kind of the weird, kind of odd person out. I felt like a cherry case, I think that was the strongest feeling. I remember feeling like I was really paranoid that anyone that was willing to give me the time of day, even I'm talking to my own friends now, but that anybody in my life, that it was a favor, that they were like, oh, well, I feel bad for this guy. Whatever, we'll hang out with him for the day because this is so sad.
And has that feeling gone away?
Yeah, I think so. It has, but only because that other life is over. It has, but it's because I stopped trying to get back the life I had and just started building a different one. So all those people that I'm thinking of when I say that about I wish they were in my life, or I don't know how they think about me. Most of those people are gone. And, and the choice became, you can either kind of look backward and try to keep recovering that, or you can just admit that look, everything has changed. And, the more time you're spending trying to get back the old thing, the more time you're losing to build something different.
Did you intentionally move away to kind of start over?
Yeah. I mean, because I was living in, I had transferred my parole to California. And so I was living in California, where I'm from. And it was making things worse. Being in places I was familiar with, I felt like I was following around a dead person. I was going to all these places that I'd been, and I felt so disconnected from that life that it really felt like you are just following around in a dead person's footsteps.
It was in that story, it seems like you were very accountable at the end.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Shit, I know I'm over here doing wrong. Let me stop because I'm interfering in people's lives.
I know. I was actually surprised by the way it ended, because I didn't see it that way. It took me by surprise when you say at the end that you were doing something you shouldn't be doing. It didn't occur to me. It seemed just okay, this is a good coping mechanism.
This is a way out.
Yeah. So is it bad I didn't see that coming?
No, I think it's great. I mean, I wouldn't want you to, that's what's fun about a predictable story. So no, I'm glad to hear that. But and it makes sense to me, actually, that reaction, that makes total sense to me. I get where you're coming from.
Would they call that a prison hack?
To me, it's a great workaround. You're figuring out
to
get what you needed.
Right.
I think the other thing that this reminds me of is with storytelling, we really root for the protagonist, and you're the protagonist in the story. So I didn't really think about how it was affecting other people. I was just oh, great, this guy's found something. It's going to get him what he needs. Good for him. I get it.
Yeah, I mean, well, and the other thing I'll say about it is I've been surprised by... And there was one show in particular. It's so funny how the Moth audiences, everyone is completely different. And there was one night where something was in the air, and there were just a ton of nurses in the audience. And people always come up to you after the shows, but usually it's just kind of more general. But like there was one night where like everybody came up, was like, that was awesome. I'm so glad you told that story. I'm a nurse. And like, it was so great to see like a nurse at the center of like one of these stories, and to like, you know, have like our work visible. And I was like, I kind of felt bad because I was like, gosh, I didn't even think of that. Like, I didn't really think about this as like a nurse story, but to them, like, not that I wasn't the protagonist, but to them, like nursing was like very much like at the center of the story.
Yeah.
And they really felt seen as nurses who, you know, and they would say like, oh yeah, like I've had guys come in from the local county jail and this and that. And like, they felt really seen by all the kind of nurse bits. So yeah, it's funny, like who's closest to the middle is, you know, of course, like depends a lot on the positionality of where that person's coming from in the audience. And so I was surprised by how many people have been like, I've had COs come up to me that ran transport in New York, and come up and be like, yeah, I did transport for 40 years, you know? And so like, of course they think of the officers as like main characters, right? So it's like, it's funny how everyone can kind of see themselves in the middle if they want to.
Well, everybody wants to be seen.
Yeah.
Michael Fischer is a writer, storyteller, and manager of the creative writing program at the University of Chicago.
You can hear another Moth story Michael told and hundreds of other funny, moving, poignant, surprising stories at the Moth's website, themoth.org.
And you can find The Moth wherever you get your podcasts.
You can even catch me and Nige on a recent episode.
Ooh, I'm so excited about that. Thanks to everyone at The Moth for working with us on these collaborative episodes. We are big fans.
Radiotopia.